something he's been waiting for, and he's probably spent more time thinking about it. For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support, and that's what we need to do.
And what does that shift look like for you?
Well, that's we don't know yet. I mean, there was an order to the years because my mother didn't change very much.
The late-night phone call shattered the silence at Gatcombe Park. Princess Anne knew before answering that everything was about to change. Within hours, she would receive news that would force two estranged brothers to confront a painful truth. King Charles was dying, and he had one final, impossible wish. What Anne discovered in those sealed letters would expose decades of royal secrets, institutional manipulation, and a heartbreaking confession that neither William nor Harry ever expected.
Apart from sort of the group of youngsters who were left behind, I suspect there was an argument about who got the rocking horse, but that's...
I wonder who won that one.
A key moment in the day.
The telephone at Gatcombe Park rarely rang after 10 in the evening. Princess Anne, at 74 years old, maintained a schedule built on military precision. Early to bed, earlier to rise, with few exceptions to that rule. So when her private study phone broke the silence at 10:47 on a Tuesday evening in March, she knew instinctively that something significant had happened. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Harrison, the King's personal physician. His carefully measured tone carried weight before he even spoke the actual words. King Charles wanted to see his sister first thing the following morning, alone. The request itself told Anne everything she needed to know. Her brother had been unwell. The palace had acknowledged as much 3 weeks earlier, but the official statements had been deliberately vague, suggesting management rather than crisis. This midnight phone call painted a very different picture. Anne asked the obvious question directly, cutting through the usual protocols and formalities. The doctor's response was equally direct. The king was asking for her specifically, and that alone should indicate the seriousness of the situation. When Anne pressed for more details, the pause on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Charles was asking for his sister, and that fact should tell her what she needed to know about his condition. Dawn arrived grey and cold over Gloucester as Anne's Range Rover pulled away from Gatcombe Park the next morning. Her security detail followed at a respectful distance, but Anne drove herself, one of the few privileges she had consistently refused to surrender over the decades. The 2-hour drive to Windsor gave her time to think, to remember, and to mentally prepare for whatever awaited her. The relationship between Anne and Charles had never been particularly close in the way siblings in ordinary families might experience closeness. They were only 17 months apart in age, but separated by worlds when it came to their roles and destinies. Charles was the heir to the throne. Anne was what some might call the spare's spare, expected to be useful and hard-working, but never central to the institution's future. Despite this distance, they shared something that went deeper than simple affection. They understood each other in ways that few others could. Both had spent their entire lives in service to an institution that demanded everything from them, while acknowledging very little in return. The last time Charles had summoned Anne in this manner was when their mother, Queen Elizabeth, was dying. Anne had been the only one the Queen trusted to hear certain difficult truths, to execute specific final wishes without allowing sentiment to cloud her judgment. Now, as Anne drove through the English countryside toward Windsor, she felt history repeating itself. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders once again, familiar but no less heavy for being so. Windsor Castle's private apartments were unusually quiet when Anne arrived. The normal bustle of staff and officials had been reduced to whispers and careful footsteps. Anne was escorted not to any of the formal receiving rooms where official business typically took place, but directly to Charles's personal study. This was the one place in all of his various residences where the king could simply be himself, away from the constant performance required by his position. Charles sat by the window when Anne entered. The morning light was harsh on features that had grown noticeably thinner. At 76, he looked every one of those years, and perhaps several more besides. But his eyes remained clear when they met Anne's, and his voice maintained its steadiness despite his obvious physical decline. Anne settled into the chair across from her brother, immediately noticing the legal documents arranged on the side table and a sealed envelope bearing Charles's personal crest. This was clearly not a social visit, and Charles wasted no time confirming that fact. The doctors, he explained, had given him 6 months to live, perhaps less than that. The treatments available would focus on managing symptoms and maintaining quality of life, rather than pursuing aggressive interventions that might buy a few additional weeks at the cost of unbearable suffering. Anne absorbed this information without any visible reaction. Decades of royal training had taught her to maintain composure in even the most emotionally charged situations, but Charles seemed to be building towards something beyond simply sharing his diagnosis with his sister. There was clearly another purpose to this urgent early morning meeting. When Charles finally spoke the name Harry, the word hung in the air between them like an accusation, or perhaps a confession. He was talking about his younger son, Prince Harry, who had left royal duties years earlier and relocated to California with his wife Meghan. The departure had created a rift in the family that had only grown wider and more painful with time. Charles had never been particularly comfortable with emotional vulnerability. 76 years of training and expectation had armored him against displays of weakness, but facing one's own mortality has a way of stripping away such protective layers, leaving only raw truth behind. When Harry left the royal family and subsequently gave revealing interviews about his experiences and grievances, Charles had told himself that his son had made his own choices. He had convinced himself that his primary duty was to the institution itself, not to one individual family member who seemed unable or unwilling to accept his designated role. Anne listened carefully as Charles continued. He admitted that he had not been entirely wrong in his initial assessment, but neither had he been completely right. The situation, he now understood, was far more complicated than he had allowed himself to acknowledge at the time. Charles reached for the sealed envelope on the table and opened it, withdrawing several pages covered in his distinctive handwriting. He explained that he had written these letters 3 weeks earlier, shortly after receiving his diagnosis. They were addressed to both of his sons, William and Harry, with separate letters for each, as well as a joint communication. These documents contained instructions and wishes for the period after his death. Anne took the pages Charles offered and began reading carefully. As she progressed through the text, she began to understand the full scope of what her brother was attempting. This was not merely a deathbed message or a final set of royal instructions. Charles was attempting something far more ambitious and far more personal. He was trying to heal a wound that had festered for years, to use his impending death as a catalyst for something he had been unable to achieve during his life. He wanted reconciliation between his sons. Charles leaned forward with sudden urgency, the earlier fragility replaced by determination. These letters needed to be delivered correctly, by the right person, at precisely the right moment, with exactly the right words accompanying them. The goal was to make William and Harry actually listen and consider what their father was trying to tell them. And Charles believed that Anne was the only person who could accomplish this delicate task. Anne understood why her brother had chosen her for this responsibility. William trusted her, judgment absolutely. Harry remembered her differently from how he remembered most of the other senior royals. In Harry's mind, Anne had never been part of the institutional machinery that he felt had ultimately crushed him. She was simply Aunt Anne, the person who told uncomfortable truths and expected people to rise to challenges rather than making excuses. As Anne read through the letters a second time, the full scope of Charles's plan became clear. He was not simply leaving final instructions for his sons. He was attempting to give them tools for healing, revealing information and perspectives that neither William nor Harry fully understood. Charles was trying to show them that their conflict had been shaped by forces and decisions beyond their individual actions and choices. Anne finally looked up from the pages and met her brother's eyes. She told him directly that what he was asking would be extremely difficult, not just for her but for both William and Harry. The wounds between the brothers ran deep, and years of public conflict had hardened their positions. Charles responded with a flash of his old authority. "Everything worthwhile is difficult," he said. "But if he died with his sons still estranged, with William and Harry still locked in their bitter standoff, then he would have failed as a father far more profoundly than he had failed in any other role during his life." Anne left Windsor several hours later with the sealed envelopes locked securely in her briefcase. The weight of her brother's final wish pressed heavily on her conscience, as she made the return journey to Gatcombe Park. She had agreed to take on this responsibility because duty always called and she always answered. But beyond the sense of obligation, Anne had agreed because Charles was fundamentally correct in his assessment. If the monarchy survived his death only to remain defined by the continued estrangement of his sons, then the institution itself would be diminished in ways that mattered, far more than public perception or media coverage. The drive back felt considerably longer than the morning journey had been. Anne's phone displayed 17 missed calls by the time she glanced at it. Palace business, charity obligations, and the endless machinery of royal life all demanded her attention. She ignored every single notification. Instead, she found herself thinking about two boys she had watched grow up under impossible circumstances and unrelenting scrutiny. William had been groomed from birth to become king. He carried the weight of that destiny with a combination of his mother Diana's natural empathy and his father Charles's deeply ingrained sense of duty. Harry, on the other hand, had always been the spare. He was brilliant in his own right, but also clearly damaged by the unique pressures of his position. He had spent much of his life desperate to be seen as more than simply his brother's shadow, more than just the backup plan for the succession. Both young men had lost so much over the years. Their mother had died when they were far too young to process that trauma effectively. Their privacy had been sacrificed to constant media scrutiny from their earliest days, and their brotherhood, which should have been a source of mutual support, had been gradually destroyed by competing narratives and palace politics that neither of them fully controlled or understood. Now they were about to lose their father as well. The critical question facing Anne was whether that final loss would drive them even further apart or whether it might, impossibly, bring them back together. Kensington Palace at dawn held a particular quality of focused purpose. William had been awake since 5 in the morning, methodically reviewing briefings for the day's scheduled engagements and responding to the correspondence that never stopped flowing into his office. At 42 years old, he had perfected the difficult art of compartmentalization. His personal feelings and concerns remained locked away while he performed the public role he had been born to fulfill. Catherine found her husband in his study, with his coffee gone cold and the same page of his briefing book apparently unread for the past 20 minutes. She observed that he seemed worried about something specific. William explained that Anne had called requesting an urgent meeting. She had refused to explain the purpose over the phone, saying only that the matter was both urgent and intensely private. Catherine's expression shifted immediately. Anne was not someone given to drama or unnecessary theatrics. If she was making an unscheduled trip to London and insisting on privacy, then whatever she needed to discuss genuinely mattered. Catherine suggested the obvious possibility that this concerned William's father. The palace statements about Charles's health had been carefully vague, perhaps too carefully worded. William acknowledged that he had tried multiple times to speak directly with his father, but the king's office kept deflecting, promising to arrange something soon while never actually scheduling a conversation. When Anne arrived at Kensington Palace, she had dressed simply but seriously in a navy suit that conveyed the gravity of her purpose without unnecessary melodrama. She declined the offer of tea, declined any small talk, and after Catherine had tactfully excused herself to give them privacy, Anne delivered her news with characteristic directness. Charles was dying. The doctors estimated 6 months at most. She was telling William now, before the official palace briefings began, because his father had wanted him to hear the truth from family first. Anne withdrew an envelope from her briefcase and placed it on the table between them. This letter, she explained, contained Charles's final wishes, what he wanted and needed from both of his sons before his death. William's response was immediate and cold when he understood that Anne meant both him and Harry. He stated, flatly, that if this conversation involved his younger brother, then it was already finished. Anne remained calm and pushed the envelope closer to William. She explained that their father had written these letters specifically to give both sons information they needed to understand how their conflict had developed and been perpetuated. What William chose to do after reading the letter would be entirely his own decision. But Charles had asked that his sons at least consider his perspective before he died. William did not open the letter immediately. He left it sitting on his desk for 3 full hours while he attended a scheduled charity engagement, smiled appropriately for the waiting cameras, and demonstrated the composed public demeanor expected of a future king. But the letter's presence haunted him throughout the day. It represented a weight that could not simply be ignored or filed away with other correspondence. Finally, alone in his study that evening, William opened the sealed envelope and began to read his father's distinctive handwriting. The letter began with an acknowledgement of the difficult circumstances under which William was receiving this information. Charles expressed regret that the news of his terminal condition had to be delivered in this manner, but explained that there were things he needed to communicate without the formality of official meetings or the pressure of making immediate decisions. What followed genuinely shocked William. Charles wrote that he was fundamentally responsible for Harry's departure from royal life. Not entirely, of course, because Harry had ultimately made his own choices as an adult. But Charles accepted that his own actions, decisions, and the systems he had either created or perpetuated had established the conditions that made Harry's exit almost inevitable. The letter detailed conversations that Charles had never previously shared with William. It described decisions made in the traumatic aftermath of Diana's death that had inadvertently placed the two brothers on diverging paths from which they would struggle to return. Charles explained how his own unresolved trauma and guilt regarding Diana, combined with his desperate attempts to protect William as the heir, had led him to create fundamentally different rules and expectations for each son. Charles admitted in the letter that he had told Harry directly when the young man turned 18 that his role in the monarchy was to support William, never to overshadow him, and that he needed to accept being permanently secondary. At the time, Charles had believed he was being practical and realistic, preparing his younger son for the actual realities of royal life. Instead, he now realized he had effectively told a grieving teenager that he mattered less than his brother. The psychological damage from that conversation had never fully healed. The letter continued with revelations about specific palace decisions that Harry had attributed to William, but which had actually originated with Charles himself. Staff reassignments that left Harry feeling isolated. Media strategies designed to protect William's public image, sometimes at Harry's expense. Financial arrangements that left the younger prince feeling dependent and controlled rather than supported and valued. Charles wrote with brutal honesty that William had assumed Harry was jealous and resentful of his position, while Harry had believed William was actively complicit in his marginalization. The uncomfortable truth, Charles now admitted, was that he himself had created an institutional system practically guaranteed to generate conflict between his sons. Then he had stepped back and allowed them to blame each other for the resulting tensions rather than acknowledging his own central role in creating those conditions. William read the entire letter 3 times. Each reading revealed additional layers of manipulation and institutional dysfunction. The manipulation had not been malicious in intent. Charles had genuinely been trying to protect the monarchy, to secure the succession, to avoid repeating the mistakes of previous generations. But in pursuing those goals, he had created entirely new problems and inflicted fresh wounds on both of his sons. The final section of the letter made a direct and personal plea. Before his death, Charles wanted to see his sons reconciled. He was explicit that this was not primarily for his own peace of mind, because he did not believe he deserved that comfort. Rather, the reconciliation was for William and Harry themselves, for their children who deserved to know their cousins, and for the monarchy, which simply could not survive another generation of public family conflict. Charles explained that he had written a parallel letter to Harry, explaining these same truths from a different perspective. What he was asking from both sons was deceptively simple, but incredibly difficult. He wanted them to meet and talk, not with lawyers present or media strategies prepared, but simply as two brothers who had lost their mother far too young and were now about to lose their father. He wanted them to try finding their way back to each other. Anne, the letter concluded, would facilitate this meeting if both brothers were willing. She was the only family member that both William and Harry trusted completely, and crucially, she was the only person willing to tell them directly when they were being foolish or unreasonable. When Catherine found William later that evening, he was sitting motionless at his desk with the pages of the letter spread before him. His expression looked as though it had been carved from stone. Catherine asked gently what the letter contained, and William told her everything. He read portions aloud, summarized other sections, and laid out the full scope of what Charles was revealing and requesting. After hearing everything, Catherine sat quietly for several moments before responding. She acknowledged that this could be seen as manipulation, that even while dying, Charles was attempting to manage narratives and control outcomes. But she also suggested that perhaps, for the first time in his life, Charles was being genuinely honest about his own role in creating the painful divisions within his family. William stated his fundamental concern directly. If he agreed to this reconciliation, this grand gesture that his father was engineering, he needed to know it would be real and meaningful, not simply a performance for cameras or a final gift to a dying man's legacy. Catherine asked what real reconciliation would look like to him, and William admitted he did not yet know. But he knew it could not happen overnight, and he knew it would require Harry to be genuinely present and engaged, not just physically present, but emotionally invested in rebuilding family relationships. That night, William called Anne and stated his decision. He would meet with Harry, but he had specific conditions that needed to be met. The meeting location had to be truly neutral territory. There could be no press access or advance notice to the media. No recordings of any kind would be permitted, and Catherine would accompany him because he needed someone present who unquestionably had his interests and well-being as their priority. Anne agreed to all the conditions without hesitation and promised to contact Harry that same evening. After ending the call, William found himself standing in his son George's bedroom, watching the 13-year-old sleep peacefully. The boy was already showing early signs of understanding the burden he would one day carry. Perhaps, William thought, if he and Harry could choose reconciliation over pride and understanding over anger, that would be the real legacy worth leaving for the next generation. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in Montecito, California, it was just past midnight when Harry's phone illuminated with an unfamiliar UK number. He very nearly declined the call. Living in California had taught him to protect his mental health and peace of mind, to establish firm boundaries against intrusions from his former life. But something made him answer anyway. Anne's voice carried clearly across 9 time zones and 17 years of complicated, painful history. She needed to tell him something about his father. Over the next 5 minutes, Anne delivered the news of Charles's terminal diagnosis with her characteristic clinical precision. 6 months to live, maybe less. The man Harry had spent years being angry with, the father who had disappointed him in countless ways, both large and small, was dying. Harry managed to say that he was sorry to hear the news. Anne acknowledged his response and then explained that Charles had asked her to deliver something to Harry. A letter that explained a great deal about decisions that had been made over the years, decisions that had shaped everything that happened afterward. These were things Harry had never been fully aware of, information that might change his understanding of events he thought he knew completely. Harry's immediate response was defensive. He said he did not need explanations because he knew what had happened. He had lived through it all. Anne's reply carried the full authority she had developed over 7 decades of royal service. She told him directly that he did not, in fact, know everything. And before he responded with anger or automatic dismissal, she strongly suggested he read what Charles had written and then make his decision about how to proceed. The letter arrived via secure courier the following morning. Harry held the sealed envelope for nearly an hour before finally opening it, acutely aware that whatever it contained would inevitably complicate emotions he had spent years working to organize into a coherent narrative that made sense of his experiences. Meghan found Harry in his home office with the letter, pages spread across his desk and tears streaming down his face. She moved to him immediately, her hand finding his shoulder as she asked what had happened. Harry's voice was raw with emotion when he finally spoke. His father had known. All those times over the years when Harry had believed William was behind certain painful decisions, when he had blamed his brother for specific instances of marginalization and unfair treatment, Charles had known the truth and had allowed Harry to believe his brother was responsible. Meghan read over Harry's shoulder, her own expression shifting rapidly from concern to anger to something far more complex as she absorbed the contents of the letter. The version Charles had written to Harry paralleled the one sent to William in its basic structure and revelations, but included additional context specific to Harry's experiences. There were apologies for particular moments that Harry had discussed publicly in interviews. There were acknowledgements of failures that Charles had never admitted before, certainly not in any public forum. Charles wrote that he had allowed Harry to believe he was less important than William because at the time he had convinced himself he was protecting the institution. He now understood that what he had really been protecting was his own fear. If he admitted that both sons mattered equally, he would have been forced to acknowledge that he was equally capable of failing both of them. That realization, apparently, had been too uncomfortable to face until mortality forced brutal honesty. For 3 full days, Harry did not call anyone connected to his former life in Britain. He read the letter repeatedly, cross-referenced its claims against his own memories of specific events, and discussed it endlessly with Meghan. His therapist had what Harry later described as a field day with these revelations, helping him untangle years of accumulated anger to find the core truths buried beneath layers of pain and resentment. During an emergency therapy session, his counselor posed the critical question directly: what did Harry intend to do with this new information? The entire course of recent royal history, the rift with William, the decision to leave Britain, the controversial interviews, all of it might have been avoided or developed differently if these truths had been known earlier. Harry sat with that possibility, trying to determine whether it changed anything fundamental about his current life and choices. His therapist suggested that perhaps everyone involved had needed to reach this particular point of crisis before the underlying truths could actually be heard and processed. Sometimes, she observed, people have to break completely before they can rebuild in healthier ways. The question now was whether Harry wanted to participate in that rebuilding process or whether he preferred to let the broken pieces remain where they had fallen. That night, Meghan found Harry standing in their daughter's nursery, watching her sleep with an expression of profound uncertainty. She said aloud what she knew he was thinking. He was considering going back to Britain. Anne had apparently told him that William had agreed to meet, that their father wanted them to talk before time ran out. Meghan asked the question directly. Did Harry actually want this? Harry remained quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing emotions and loyalties. Part of him wanted to let everything stay broken, he finally admitted, to simply say he had moved on, built a new life in California, and no longer needed any of them. But another part of him recognized that Charles was his father and William was his brother, and their father was dying. This letter suggested that maybe they had all been fighting the wrong battle all along, reacting to manipulations and institutional pressures that none of them had fully understood. He turned to face Meghan directly. What if the real enemy had never been each other? What if they had all been responding to systemic problems that pitted them against one another while the actual source of their pain remained hidden and unaddressed? They talked through the night, with Meghan deliberately playing devil's advocate and pushing Harry to examine his motivations from every possible angle. She pointed out that if he returned to Britain and the meeting went badly, they would be reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. Their children were settled in California. Harry had found a measure of peace in his new life. Was it genuinely worth risking all of that stability? Harry countered with his own question. Was peace truly the same thing as healing? Or was it sometimes just a different form of avoidance? A way of not dealing with the parts that still hurt? Meghan smiled slightly at that response. She acknowledged that 5 years of intensive therapy ought to produce some useful insights. More seriously, she took his hand and told him she could not make this decision for him. She could only promise to support whatever choice he made. But she emphasized that he needed to be completely honest with himself about what he hoped would happen, because if he was expecting some tearful reunion where everything was magically fixed and forgiven, he was setting himself up for profound disappointment. Harry called his aunt at 4 a.m. California time, which made it noon in England. He told Anne directly that he would come to Britain for the meeting, but he needed her word on something specific first. Anne asked what assurance he required. Harry stated his terms clearly. This could not be a palace setup with photographers conveniently positioned nearby or details leaked to friendly journalists. If he was doing this, it had to remain genuinely private. Anne agreed immediately. Charles's letter had been explicit on this point. The reconciliation attempt was not for public consumption or media management. This was meant to be a private opportunity for two brothers to finally have the honest conversation they should have had years ago, without institutional interference or strategic communications considerations. Anne explained the logistics. The meeting would take place the following week at a private estate in Scotland, far from London and the concentrated attention of the royal press corps. She would personally arrange everything to ensure complete security and privacy. Harry asked whether their father would be present at this meeting. Anne paused before answering. Charles had specifically decided he would not attend. He believed his physical presence would transform the encounter into a reconciliation performance, staged for his benefit and emotional comfort. This meeting needed to be entirely about William and Harry and their relationship, not about performing forgiveness for a dying man. Harry felt something unexpected at that moment: respect. His father, for perhaps the first time in Harry's memory, was putting his son's actual needs and relationship ahead of his own emotional requirements. It was possibly the most genuinely selfless thing Charles had ever done, and that realization carried significant weight. Harry confirmed he would be there. The process of packing for the trip felt surreal in ways Harry had not fully anticipated. He had not been back to Britain in 8 months, and each previous visit since leaving royal duties had been carefully orchestrated and limited. Fly in, attend to whatever necessary business required his physical presence, then leave again before the media could manufacture drama or controversy. This trip felt fundamentally different. It was open-ended and therefore dangerous, with no clear script or predetermined outcome. At the airport, Meghan held him tightly and made him promise to call every single day. She reminded him that he did not owe anyone his mental health or emotional well-being. If the situation felt toxic or wrong, he retained the right to leave. Harry assured her he understood, but Meghan pressed the point. Did he really understand? Because the old Harry, the one shaped by years of institutional expectations, would have stayed and suffered through whatever happened simply because that was what had always been expected of him. The new Harry, the one who had done years of therapy and established boundaries, knew he could set limits and protect himself. Harry kissed his wife and held her longer than strictly necessary. He promised that whatever happened in Scotland, whatever transpired in that meeting, he was coming home to her and their children. That was not negotiable or dependent on how the reconciliation attempt proceeded. The flight across the Atlantic gave Harry 12 full hours to think, remember, and mentally rehearse every possible version of how the meeting with William might unfold. By the time the plane touched down at Edinburgh, he had imagined at least 50 different conversations, each ending either in genuine breakthrough or complete breakdown. The reality, he suspected with a mixture of hope and dread, would probably be considerably messier than either extreme. Anne met him personally at the private airfield. Her presence served as both reassurance and gentle intimidation, a reminder of the seriousness of what they were attempting. She told Harry directly that his brother had arrived an hour earlier and was just as nervous as Harry himself, though William would never admit such vulnerability aloud. Harry asked whether William had said anything specific about seeing him after all this time. Anne replied that William had committed to listening, which was honestly more than she had expected given the depth of anger and resentment on both sides. That willingness to listen represented a starting point, however tentative. They drove through the Scottish countryside in relative silence. The landscape was grey and beautiful in the distinctively Scottish manner that Harry had almost forgotten. He realized with some surprise that he had genuinely missed this, not the suffocating aspects of royal life, but the simple geography and atmosphere of home. As they approached the estate, Harry spoke quietly. He thanked Anne for facilitating this meeting, for taking on the difficult role of intermediary and peacemaker. Anne glanced at him with an expression that was difficult to read. She told him not to offer thanks yet, because this conversation might very well turn out to be the most difficult of his entire life. Harry acknowledged that he had certainly had some extremely difficult conversations over the past several years. Anne's response was measured. Their father's final wish hung over all of them like something that could turn out to be either a blessing or a curse. They would not know which until the meeting was finished and they could assess what had actually been accomplished or destroyed. Balmoral Lodge sat at the edge of the estate, deliberately positioned away from the main castle's tourist traffic and concentration of staff. The 18th century hunting lodge had been converted for private royal family use generations earlier. It offered the intimacy necessary for genuine privacy combined with the isolation required for complete discretion. Anne had chosen this location very specifically. It represented neutral ground that belonged to neither brother's world, nor William's future, nor Harry's past. When Harry entered the lodge, William stood by the window with his posture rigid and his hands clasped behind his back in a stance their father had perfected over decades. Catherine sat on the sofa, visibly calmer but clearly watchful. The room seemed to hold decades worth of unspoken tension, years of accumulated hurt and anger that had never been properly addressed or resolved. William spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. Harry responded with equal formality. Anne, demonstrating her characteristic pragmatism, gestured firmly to the seating she had arranged around the fireplace. She told them both to sit down, making it clear they were not going to conduct this conversation standing up as though they were at some formal state reception. Harry took the armchair positioned opposite Catherine, who offered a small, complicated smile. It was acknowledgement without warmth, professionalism without pretense, a recognition that they were all about to navigate extremely difficult emotional territory. William finally turned from the window and settled beside his wife, and the real conversation was finally about to begin. William began the conversation with a direct question. He assumed Harry had received the same letter he had. Harry confirmed this was true. William's next question carried an edge of skepticism. Did Harry actually believe what their father had written? Did he think Charles's deathbed confession somehow absolved Harry of years of choices that had damaged the family? Harry felt the familiar spark of anger rising but deliberately pushed it down. This was exactly the destructive dynamic they needed to break. He responded carefully, saying he thought their father's letter revealed that both brothers had been reacting to incomplete information. That did not absolve anyone of responsibility, but it did provide important context. Anne intervened before the exchange could escalate. She reminded them that Charles had written these letters specifically to give both sons information they needed to understand how their conflict had been manufactured. The responsibility lay partly with their father, partly with institutional systems, and partly with both brothers being too proud to admit they might have been wrong. William stood abruptly and stated flatly that he had not been wrong. Harry had abandoned his duty. Harry interrupted, his voice rising despite his earlier intention to remain calm. He had been told repeatedly that his duty was to exist as William's shadow, to support but never shine, to smile while being offered less protection and less support because the heir's comfort had to come first. Catherine spoke for the first time. She was not defending every institutional decision, she said carefully, but Harry had made choices that hurt them deeply. The interviews, the book detailing private conversations, these actions had made life harder for her children and exposed family matters that should have remained confidential. Harry surprised them both with his response. He said clearly that he regretted certain aspects of his public statements, the things he had said in anger, the details he had shared that were not his alone to reveal. He had been so focused on finally being heard that he had not adequately considered all the costs. Anne produced another document from her briefcase. She had spent the previous week gathering evidence of every significant decision made regarding both brothers from Diana's death until Harry's departure. What she had discovered was systematic bias, remarkably consistent over the years. She spread the papers between the brothers. Financial allocations showing Harry received significantly less funding than William for comparable work. Security arrangements that protected William's family far more comprehensively. Media strategies that deliberately positioned Harry as the unpredictable prince to make William appear more responsible by contrast. William studied the documents carefully. He finally admitted that he had not known about most of these specific decisions. Anne pointed out that of course he had not known. William himself had been protected from understanding the ugly mechanics of how institutional preference actually operated. William paced to the fireplace. When he finally spoke again, his voice was tight with emotion he typically kept locked away. He asked Harry if he had any concept of what it meant to carry the weight of succession from birth, to know that every choice affected not just personal life, but the stability of an entire nation. Harry admitted quietly that he did not, and could, not fully understand that burden. William turned to face his brother directly. He said he had envied Harry. He repeated the confession, explaining that when Harry left and used his freedom to publicly attack everything William had sacrificed to protect, the pain had been unbearable. Harry said he had not seen it that way at all. From his perspective, William had possessed everything that mattered. William responded that they had both been wrong. They were both prisoners of the same system, just confined in different cells.